So we'll start at the beginning with the question, who is my neighbor? We've been saying it all morning, but the question gets asked to Jesus by what the text says is a lawyer. And we all love lawyers. I'm just kidding. But, it makes sense for a lawyer to really look for that clarifying term. He's a learned person. He's trying to get to the exact meaning after he's asked what you need to do to have eternal life. And Jesus says, what does the Bible say? Or what does Torah say? And he says, love God, love your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus says, right, so who is my neighbor? Now, we always anthropomorphize this. This is about people, right? So what we're going to do this morning is look at a possibility here. The question posed in who is my neighbor has endured within Christian ethical, especially discourse, as provocation toward compassion and responsibility and kindness beyond familiar boundaries. Yet its force lies not only in moral and ethical demand, but really in perceptual representation and reorientation. Before neighborliness becomes an ethical response, it unsettles habits of seeing. It disrupts attention and assumptions about proximity, belonging, and relational significance. The parable of the Good Samaritan may therefore be approached not solely as instruction and charitable action, but as an invitation into transformed perception. So this morning, I believe it was William made the comment about flesh meeting flesh and how impactful that is, and that's true. There was one of my favorite philosophers, his name Maurice Merleau-Ponty, and he talks about the flesh of the world. So we're going to come back to that. And when William said that this morning, I said, yes, I've got a hook. So that was good. But it's about perception. So keep that in mind. Interpretations of this narrative have often operated with implicitly human parameters, focusing on social inclusion or interpersonal obligation. Such readings remain indispensable, of course, but they do risk reinforcing an anthropocentric horizon in which vulnerability and recognition are confined to human actors alone. In an era marked by ecological destabilization, species loss, and environmental displacement, the conditions under which neighborliness must be perceived have shifted. Exposure to vulnerability extends beyond human encounters. Landscapes flood, forests burn, ecosystems fracture. Sometimes it's 60 degrees in Chicago on a February day, like yesterday. Rendering visible forms of precarity that exceed conventional ethical framing. This expanded field invites reconsideration of how neighborliness itself is constituted. If perception precedes response, the scope of ethical relation is shaped by what becomes perceptually available. Ecological theology has drawn attention to this dynamic, suggesting that recognition of more than human presence emerges through disciplined attentiveness and being addressed, cultivated in encounter. To ask who counts as neighbor is therefore to ask how perception has been structured and how it might be reconfigured. Visual culture plays a significant role in this reconfiguration. Images do not simply illustrate ethical commitments. They train perception by staging encounters that redistribute attention. Works of art create environments in which vulnerability and refuge become experientially available rather than conceptually asserted. So this paper in a nutshell approaches neighborliness through such encounters, exploring how the figures of the cross and the tree operate within modern art as sites where exposure and belonging are held in tension. Rather than treating these forms as symbolic carriers of predetermined meaning, the discussion of my paper here attends to how they reshape relational awareness across human and more than human domains. In doing so, I propose that neighborliness may be understood not primarily as moral extension of human aims, but as a cultivated capacity to dwell within shared and porous exposure. So in my paper, I use this term ecological intentionality, which is from the phenomenological world, if you know any philosophy. But ecological intentionality functions as sort of this grounding where ideas like consciousness, relational networks, and theological implications can sort of interweave, and this becomes the framework for what I'm arguing for here, where we have to take that concept of neighbor, both in this text and throughout, I would say, the Bible itself, and reframe that. So as we go through, I'm not reading the whole paper, so I'm having to skip here just to be aware of our time. If neighborliness is shaped by what becomes perceptually available, contemporary ecological conditions compel reconsideration of the field within which vulnerability is encountered. The Anthropocene, whether it's understood as a geological designation or a cultural diagnosis, names not only environmental alteration, but the redistribution of exposure across planetary systems. And we've seen countless ways over the last few years of how what we term as the Anthropocene can be evidence of both our own actions, but also how we inhabit that relationship with the wider world. Let me shift down, sorry. So philosophically, these reconsiderations resonate with traditions that have been attentive to relational perception. Oakskill gives an account of organism environment that emphasizes that living beings inhabit field structure through engagement rather than passive reception. Then we get into people like my main focus of study is on Edith Stein and her notion of empathy from the phenomenological background, not as kind of that kindness empathy, but real empathy that's much different than kind of what Ellie was also talking about with social media usage today. Visual culture participates in this refinement by staging encounters that render ecological relation perceptible. Artistic works that engage living materials or environmental processes do not make theoretical claims directly. They cultivate attentiveness by situating viewers within fields of responsiveness. Ecological intentionality thus serves as a perceptual grounding for what follows, stabilizing the expansion of neighborliness explored in this paper and preparing the transition toward phenomenological encounter and visual interpretation. So for instance, I get into the conversation of how the cross itself becomes this interaction with ecology, primarily depicted as being made of wood. A lot of that comes from the 14th century, or Francis of Assisi and the nativity scenes and that kind of thing. But even here, we have the hypercube from Dali, and the cross here takes on not just a multidimensional aspect, but the figure of Christ is seen to be sort of floating on that. So Dali here is doing much more, obviously, than just putting the Christ on the cross with this opportunity for encounter. And to really explore that, I go into how Merleau-Ponty talks about the flesh of the world and emphasizing the intercorporeal character of perception. So bodies do not occupy space as isolated units, but participate within fields structured through a reciprocity of seeing and being seen, touching and being touched, addressed and being addressed, or addressing and being addressed. To perceive a landscape is simultaneously to be situated within it, and encounter becomes mutual rather than unilateral. The cross occupies a central place within the Christian visual imagination, obviously, yet its interpretive force is often stabilized within doctrinal or symbolic frameworks that treat it primarily as an emblem of suffering or redemption. Such readings remain important, but they risk closing the image before it is encountered. Dali's Corpus Hypercubus provides a particularly generative site for this type of reconsideration. The crucified body is suspended within the unifold geometry of a hypercube rather than affixed to a wooden structure. The composition gestures toward dimensional expansion rather than material weight. Exposure is rendered neither as physical collapse nor as devotional illustration. Instead, the body inhabits an environment structured by openness, inviting a perception of vulnerability rather than enclosure. Theological implications to follow from this repositioning include ideas of refuge. And refuge has often been imagined as protection from exposure. However, like here with Dolly's rendering, there's gestures toward a different articulation. Refuge appears through statedness within expanded relation rather than separation from it. The cross does not shield, it locates. It situates bodies within shared structures of vulnerability rather than isolating them from harm. And then we get into a conversation about the tree itself, the notion of the tree not sort of similarly being a companion symbol, and the ideas of rootedness and refuge, offering literal shelter, but also symbolic shelter, from Abraham at the oaks to the tree of life, to Jesse's lineage, the root of Jesse, from which King David comes, and that sort of thing. But also, trees are vulnerable, as we see now, both with our ecological problems, but also they bear witness, being rooted in place, and the shifts and the violence of their surroundings are often echoed in their bark and branches. So that takes me to our conclusion here with the convergence of the ideas of suffering, witness, and refuge that both the cross and trees make clear in our history of art. And again, Christian visual tradition has long intertwined the cross and trees. There's medieval manuscripts depicting the cross sprouting leaves, the living wood. Christ's crucifixion is imagined as occurring on wood from Eden's tree in some traditions, complementing a narrative arc from the fall to the redemption, as we saw this morning with the stained glass, which was amazing. And this is contemporary art from Andy Goldsworthy, and it's just half of an arm. The depiction here sort of cut it off, but it's a bronze arm. This is from the, I believe, early 2000s. And there's also Anna Mendieta, who has Earth Body Works as well, and creates what are sort of like ecological memorials, again, using trees and this idea of vulnerability, but also offering refuge and encounter. So in conclusion, if we return to the lawyer's question, who is my neighbor? With these visual and theological resources, we might reframe neighborliness not as a category boundary, but as a perceptual practice. The neighbor is whoever enters into relation with us, be it a tree, be it a frog, be it another human, whoever makes a claim on our attention through their vulnerability or presence. This does not collapse all distinctions or romanticize more than human or non-human life. It recognizes that perception itself can be ethical. What we notice, how we attend, whom or what we recognize as mattering, these are not natural acts. Just as Jesus is demanding our attention with that parable to think a little differently. But they are formative for our moral world. So then, the cross, last part. The cross and the tree are not metaphors we impose on the world, but patterns we discover within it as patterns of suffering held, vulnerability dignified, and refuge offered across boundaries we once thought absolute. So to ask who is my neighbor with ecological and phenomenological seriousness is to allow these questions to reshape perception itself. Thank you all for your attention. I appreciate it.